Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Cowan. I am the Cameron Journal. Not just me. We have great contributors, but I'm the host of the Cameron Journal Newshour, and each week we get together and we talk about a handful of headlines rather than dealing with the fire hose of information that everyone else is reading. All this type of thing. I try to bring you the best of the best, the cream at the top, and go from there. Get you on your week with knowledge to be interesting at parties and all this sort of thing. Which is why I always say, like, to make it interesting to talk to people and all this type of thing. I never go anywhere or do anything because I'm busy doing this. So good for you for being interesting at parties. One of these days, I might escape the studio myself, and be interesting at parties too. Um, which is always fun. So we have a lot going on this week. So much. I really wanted to, in the beginning, before we dig into headlines, I really wanted to dig into sort of a narrative that has been percolating through the internet and online discussion forums and this type of thing. Um, and that is, well, let me start with the headline and then we'll kind of go from there. So, last week I was not here because I was doing a little traveling. Um, you probably heard about the ratings collapse at MSNBC and CNN. There was even a brief rumor of like Elon Musk trying to buy MSNBC from Comcast, but apparently that's not possible. Whatever. Um, and part of this came out of, so there's kind of this ratings drop coming out of the election for these liberal news channels. And I'm not surprised because people have been openly saying, oh, I'm taking a break from the news, I'm unplugging, I'm not gonna, do another 4 years of this, I'm not going to be, forever vigilant, I'm going to, go check out, take care of myself, protect my sanity, all this type of thing. And I'm not surprised about that, and there's been a corresponding ratings drop at the big liberal news channels. And then kind of that was kind of the main layer. The next layer down has to do with Morning Joe. And Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, who are the hosts of Morning Joe and have been for almost 20 years at this point, they decided to go down to Mar-a-Lago and meet with Trump and talk about, coverage and all this sort of thing and try to mend fences and build bridges because they were friends with Trump, as were many people before he ran for president and all this sort of thing. And so they went down there to kind of, see if they could, sort of patch things up. Obviously, with Trump saying that he wants to, start vindictive cases against, anyone who was against him and against journalists and all this sort of thing. And already, I think, making indications going in that direction. I think they were trying to get off the shit list as much as possible. Now, do I think their little tete-a-tete in Mar-a-Lago is going to help them with that? Probably not. But it has kind of sent the liberal media world into a bit of a tizzy because it is kind of like, well, it seems like they're just kind of folding. But I think it's indicative, all of this, the drop at MSNBC, Joe and Mika going to Mar-a-Lago, liberals giving up on the news, all this sort of thing. I think this really belies, a greater story and a greater problem. And that is as follows. I think there's kind of, generally speaking, a surrender on the left that nobody's really talking about. And I think deserves a lot more attention than it's getting. And none of this surprised me because this is the mood that I've been in since the election. I have told personal friends, and I've also, made indications here that, look, the American people have looked at the last 10, 15 years of the liberal program in this country, and they gave a loud and affirmative, no, no thank you, not interested, to the whole thing. Trans, DEI, pronouns, the whole thing. This was an election about identity politics, and the Republicans cleaned up. Not, I think, as much as they would have liked to have, but they cleaned up. We're finally getting final vote totals out of California, and it looks like Kamala Harris, got 74 million votes or so. Donald Trump didn't even actually crest 50% in the final count. Um, and and so there's, sort of um, been this real sort of idea that Trump has some sort of mandate. It wasn't quite as mandatey as we think. I mean, that election night map is very, very red, but when you look at actual vote totals, it was actually a quite close election. She only lost Wisconsin by 9,000 votes. I mean, the whole election was thrown by 100,000 people in 5 states. um and so I think it's, very important to, kind of keep that in mind. But unfortunately, that reality, as good as it is, I think, for the country to show that there were actually a lot of people that were like, yes, we'll take the nice brown lady. Um, the repudiation of the left, um, and the whole liberal program, really kind of starting with Obama, I think has been so complete that a lot of the left is just surrendering. And I've said that too. I've said it's time to put up the white flag. They clearly do not want what we are selling. And obviously, right now, there's a lot of soul searching. There's a lot of looking around the Democratic Party as to what to do and how to win elections moving forward and all this type of thing. I don't think that conversation much matters, to be very frank with you. But I do feel quite strongly, that the American left is basically surrendering. And I think a lot of it comes from the Trump has said what he's going to do. He's made it very clear what he's going to do. He's already making moves to do that thing the minute he is in office. And I think it is quite vital, um, to uh, have a very, good conversation about where do we go from here. And I think for a lot of people, the going from here is, look, we lost, it's over, we're done. Like, it's not that we're not gonna resist, we're not going to be vigilant, we're not gonna do all the things we did in 2017 to 2021. Nope, we're just done. I already know of several people who either have left the country or are going to be by the end of this year. Um, and we still have a long way to go to January 20th. We have what, 55 ish days. Um, I'm not looking forward to having to have Kamala Harris certify her own defeat in the Senate, in January. That's going to be, well, as sad as Al Gore doing it in 2000. And although probably less violent than Mike Pence doing it in 2017, um, or I'm sorry, 2021 rather. But it's, I think there's a general feeling on the left of, he said exactly what he's going to do. You voted for him because the price of groceries is too high, and you're mad about ID politics stuff. And so all the other stuff they want to do, including everything from Project 2025, all the people said, oh, he's not associated with that. He's hired 6 people from Project 2025 to run the government. So for someone who's not associating himself with Project 2025, it seems like, he's getting awfully cozy. For someone who knows nothing about it, knows no one with it, isn't affiliated, all of a sudden everyone from Project 2025 is now working at the White House. So do with that information what you will. But it means that they knew the whole time. And that whole, when the everything in Project 25 was coming out in the summer and the numbers were going against Trump, and a lot of that was Harris's early popularity was Trump Project 2025 stuff, and he dissociated himself from it. That was a smart move for the Trump campaign. I totally get why they did it. But the reality is that this has been the plan the entire time. Trump's name appears in the Project 2025 plan lots of times. He has hired 6 people who worked on the team, including appointments that innocuous things like the FCC, all this sort of thing. They're openly making plans of cutting the government as much as humanly possible, and honestly, as inhumanly as possible. They want to privatize everything from things as pedantic as the National Weather Service to several other things, including mass layoffs across the board. There have been rumors of trying to implement some sort of flat tax to try to cut down on the IRS. it goes on and on and on and on, of how they want to remake this country in their image. And the reality is that the whole Trump Elon Musk Project 2025 thing is, it's a culmination of 50 years of work by the conservative movement trying to undo the progressivism that was contained in the New Deal. And now they're at the point where they actually might be able to do it in a very meaningful way with the type of authoritarian who's willing to buck every rule, buck every law, even the Constitution, and get rid of stuff. But I think because of all of that, a lot of people on the left are just checking out. They're giving up. They're going to take care of themselves. They're going to survive. I've been telling people, I said, we're not going to be able to stop this now. All we can do is survive it. And there's already consternation in corporate America over the mass deportations. And I've said for a long time, you are never going to solve illegal immigration in this country until you get corporate America off the teat of cheap labor. They're not going to have that taken away from them sitting down. They're just not. And I think it's kind of funny that Trump didn't, I guess, realize that, or anyone on his team realized that early on, that corporate America relies on that. And they're not going to let that go if they can help it. Not meaningfully. So, it's, yeah, it's a very difficult, a very difficult thing, a very difficult time. And I think, a lot, there's also, within this thread, there's also been a lot of talk about, the rise of Blue Sky, which is sort of a Twitter replacement, and how popular that's getting, particularly with left liberal people, and the number of stars and celebrities that are moving over there as well, people that are leaving Twitter behind, all this type of thing. I'm personally right now using both. If you want to follow me on Blue Sky, it's at Cameron Journal. And that link actually should be on the website already. If it's not, it'll be soon at CameronJournal.com. But yeah, it's I've already actually started moving content over there, like my weekly newsletter that comes out on Saturdays. That's getting posted to Blue Sky. I posted the first one on Blue Sky this weekend because there's an integration with WordPress now. So make sure to follow for that, and don't obviously forget to subscribe, and it will get delivered to your inbox, which is really, really fantastic. Anyway, there's been a lot of talk about that movement as well, and I think a lot of the left is just, no one, I mean, you look around, no one's protesting, there's very little activity, people are just kind of like, you know what, America's gonna have to figure it out the hard way. And my only fear is that there's a lot of us who are gonna get hurt while the rest of the country figures this out. I was sitting with a friend the other night, and I was explaining to be kind of like, I'm a walking, talking marginalized community, and I'm a journalist. I made a video a couple weeks ago talking about how, this job now includes the potential for arrest and death, and I've had to get used to that. But I'm still here for now. And he kind of patted me on the shoulder. He's like, "Oh, dude, I didn't know you were taking the election so hard." Well, not everybody's affected by this the same way. He's a straight white dude. He's not. It will be ages before any of this stuff ever gets down to him. He's working in an in-demand field. He's in a position that will be relatively unaffected by all of this. Now, obviously, tariffs and things are going to affect him because he has to buy things, and the price of things are going to go up and all this sort of thing. But he's in a much better position to navigate this than some of the rest of us are. And I'm reminded in 2017, I had a similar conversation with someone else, and 6 weeks after the election, he texted me, and he's like, "Dude, I think Trump was a bad idea." And it's going to be the same sad sack situation moving forward. We're going to be in the same the same sort of find out situation that everyone's going to be going through. And the sad thing is, this has already started and Trump isn't even in office yet. That's, I think, kind of the funny part, is that Trump's not even in office yet, and the cracks are already beginning to show. The problems are already on display. And I think that's kind of the saddest part, is that, it's already here. We're already finding out. There's already debates over, what is, these policies going to be, and how, whose taxes are and are not going to get raised. And you have, all these nominations, and Trump doesn't want them to get FBI background checked, and the Senate is having to assert itself in its role as advising consent for nominations and all this type of thing. And the reality is, Trump is a circus. That's how he keeps attention on himself. And I think a lot of people just don't want to be involved in the Trump circus. And I think this even goes into why people are cutting off family members, cutting off friends, getting divorced, is nobody wants to be a part of that in any way they can sort of distance themselves from it. They are. And I think it's I think it's a natural reaction to what happened with this election and the narratives around it and the way we've talked about it and the way it appears that this is what the country wants in a big way. As I said, I'm not surprised that Trump won. I thought it would happen. I had hope, but I was the one in August who said you can't swap out a presidential candidate 3 months before an election and win, and the DNC may have just lost it, and I was right. Never had I wished to be more to be wrong, but I was right. And so it's a quite sad state of affairs sort of thing, that we find ourselves in this position. I am still surprised they got unified government. That still floors me to this day. That still floors me, to be kind of like, wow. And also the level of split ticket voting. It now appears that Democrats just stayed home. People are saying it's over Gaza and Palestine. I don't think that's the case. I think it was perhaps a lack of enthusiasm, a lack of reaching Democrat voters. And I think it's amazing at how Democrats down ticket did much better. Although we did lose a few like John Tester in Montana, Democrats did much better down ticket, except for John Tester in Montana, than Kamala Harris did. Although Kamala Harris outperformed Bernie Sanders in Vermont, which I think is funny. I think it really is that, rather than, I think, trying to navel gaze among how do we reform the party to, fit with, Americans and all this type of thing, I think people need to realize they just didn't like her. And I think a lot of it was they didn't have enough time to really get to know her. And that was something I'd heard in people that I had asked. Was like, well, how, why couldn't you vote for her? And it was that we just didn't really know her that well. She was just kind of burst onto the scene. I think a lot of people felt like her appointment as the nominee was a bit undemocratic because there was no primary and all this sort of thing. And her 2020 run had been so disastrous. And so there was multiple factors. However, the downside, I think, is that Democrats are going to look inside, and what they're going to do, and it's to some degree already started, is every marginalized community who's honestly started to have a real political voice in this country for the last 10 years or so is getting thrown overboard immediately. And it's kind of starting already, but it's particularly starting with Black people. Not only are Black people kind of done with the Democratic Party because white women didn't show up and white men voted overwhelmingly for Trump and all this type of thing, but I think it's also coming from a place of, we can't do the saving throw every time. And I think, the focus is, well, how do we appeal to white voters? And the answer is going to be separating yourself from identity politics. And in fact, I commented on Twitter the other day, and I said, oh yeah, they're going to dump identity politics. And someone immediately responded and said, yeah, I really hope we're done with all of that. Well, if you're not affected by it, I'm sure it's fine. Sure. I'm sure you'd be very happy that we're, done with it. But if you are affected by it, then it's a very different it's a very different kind of set of circumstances, you know. Um, but I think that's going to be the movement from now on, really, is to just not pay attention to anything to do with race, sex and sexuality, any of that stuff. And so, socially speaking, I think the social end of liberalism is probably going to take a back seat as opposed to economic liberalism, a bit of protectionism, all this type of thing. I think it's also rather funny that we're mirroring the 1920s. I think people forget the most restrictive immigration we'd ever had in this country was signed in 1925, and it basically stopped all outside immigration, and it would do so for 40 years. You could only immigrate to this country under very specific and narrow circumstances, and we basically went from an entirely open system to an entirely closed system almost overnight. Um, and I think also the coming out of World War I, the America First movement, and that's what it was called, which sort of blossomed into American fascism, um, was quite significant in terms of wanting to look after and take care of this country, and not get involved in Europe's problems. And that even in the lead up to World War II, we had let World War II go on for 2 years without getting involved. Before before we finally were kind of pulled in thanks to the Japanese, um, mostly because there was just no will to get involved in another protracted European conflict. And so, in many ways, we are mirroring the 1920s, although perhaps without the economic boom, because ours started with the pandemic, and the cost of living is up and all this sort of thing. So the 2020s aren't roaring quite as good as the 1920s, and we don't have prohibition think time, which is very helpful. But we're certainly in on certain matters mirroring the 1920s. I think after the forever wars in the Middle East and all this type of thing, that American impulse to pull in, to isolate, to protect ourselves, all this type of thing, and not engage with the rest of the world that's always crazy and has too many issues that can never be solved, and all this type of thing. I think there's that natural desire to sort of, close the ranks, close the walls, close the gates, close the everything, and try to just kind of worry about ourselves and our own problems. Which, ironically, is what the left is doing and the right's mad about it. But that's what they want to do to the country, because engaging with the world, it's tough, it's scary, it's not easy. These problems are not solved overnight, not by any stretch of the imagination. And we have never, as a country, had the patience to engage with these international issues and conflicts and be in it and with it for the long term solution. Um, that's just not who we are, for better or for worse. And so now we're going to try to isolate and try to just be about ourselves. I think the tough part about that is that that's going to allow. I mean, we're already moving into a multipolar world. I think that's going to allow China, Russia, Iran, and other players to expand their power broadly and cause more and increasing conflict. And I think, much like how Obama tried to step back from the world stage and it kind of backfired, I think this will also similarly backfire and cause more and bigger problems down the road. And we kind of already see that with what's going on in Ukraine. Um, and you may have heard, this is a good transition to the news. You may have already heard that there's been a lot of talk about Russia's new intermediate missile, the Oreshkin. I wrote about it in the newsletter on Saturday that went out to Cameron Journal subscribers. Um, and uh, and this the new missile is much talked about because it goes at Mach 12, and which is really just the warheads in their terminal phase and all this sort of thing. But it's supposed to prevent, it's supposed to be better than any Western air defense system and all this type of thing, even though it's actually probably 15 years behind what we have here in the West. But this is, another layer of escalation to that conflict. And I think a lot of people are looking at it and being like, oh, can we please get out of this? And the reality is that by getting out of it, it means Ukraine is going to become part of Russia. Um, and that will prevent Putin's nightmare of Ukraine becoming more Western aligned than anything, than anything else. And I think, and there's also the whole idea that, Russia tried to become part of the West and ultimately was rejected, which was literally the story of Russia as a country. Um, but it's there's a lot of mistruths. And I don't say misinformation, I say mistruths because people take the reality of Russia's post-Soviet relationship with the West and they twist things around to suit a pro-Russian narrative that makes NATO look like an aggressor. And people say, well, NATO wasn't supposed to expand, so that Russia would never have to share a border with NATO, and it's like, well, yes, that is true to a point, but it was also an alliance that countries can freely apply to join. And the reality is the way that Russia behaved in the post-Soviet period made newly independent former Soviet bloc countries very nervous, and it made them want to join NATO as a defense bulwark against Russia trying to claw back land it had lost in the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence, particularly of the Baltics, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And that was so there's more to that story than a lot of the Russian propaganda lets you believe. So, that's a look at the international headlines. That's a look at kind of what's happening here in America. That's, sort of the monologue segment. Let's turn to the news. And the first bit I want to talk about. Nope, that's not the one I want. Nope. This one? Not that either. There we go. The first one I want to talk about is Scott Bessent and his coming global economic reordering and what he wants to be a part of it. And so this was interesting. It's Wall Street Journal. Now, if you're not aware, Scott Bessent is a former George Soros person, and he is Trump's pick for Secretary Treasury. There was a lot of blah, blah, blah about who was going to be Treasury Secretary. But I think I think it's interesting, kind of his view of things. And it says here that Trump selected him from several candidates jockeying for the job, partly because he trusted him to execute the administration's policies more than other contenders. The Wall Street Journal has reported the decision came after Elon Musk criticized Bessent as a business-as-usual choice while lobbying for Cantor Fitzgerald, CEO Howard Lutnick instead. Trump later nominated Lutnick to lead the Commerce Department. Many on Wall Street, including hedge fund managers Daniel Loeb and Bill Ackman, applauded the selection of Bessent. Investor Kyle Bass said on social media platform X that Bessent was the single best choice. People who've worked with Bessent describe him as reserved and professorial. He once taught economic history at Yale University, his alma mater, and as an investor, he would often research forgotten financial analogs to inform his views on current events. We're going to have some sort of grand global economic reordering, Bessent said at a June event. I'd like to be part of it. I've studied this. He joined Soros Fund Management in 1991, where his research on weakness in the UK housing market was a catalyst behind the firm's enormously successful bet that the British pound would collapse. From 2011 to 2015, Bessent served as Soros' chief investment officer, earning more than $1 billion in profits for successful bets in Japan, including a wager against the Japanese yen. He left to launch his own hedge fund firm, Keysquare Capital Management, which he still manages. Keysquare's hedge fund had years of unremarkable performance until it gained about 31% in its main fund in 2022. In 2023, and so far this year, the fund has gained more than 10% according to an investor. November has been the best month for the fund, in part because it's a bet that a Trump victory would bolster the market. By comparison, the S&P 500 is up around 25% so far this year, although macro hedge funds haven't done nearly as well. Since 2020, Bessent and his husband, former New York City prosecutor John Freeman, have primarily lived in Charleston, South Carolina, near Bessent's childhood home. They have 2 children. Bessent should be confirmed as Treasury Secretary, will oversee this. Should he be confirmed as Secretary of Treasury, will oversee the sale of trillions of dollars of U.S. government bonds of the type he's used to trade. His other responsibilities will include advising on fiscal policy, handling tax collection, enforcing sanctions, and more. Bessent has long been worried that the U.S. has heavy debt, and he thinks that the main way it can be reduced is by boosting growth, which increases tax revenues. He's advised Trump to pursue a policy he calls 333, inspired by former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who revitalized the Japanese economy in the 2010s with his three-arrow economic policy. Bessent's three arrows include cutting the budget deficit to 3% of gross domestic product by 2028, spurring GDP growth of 3% through deregulation, and producing an additional 3 million barrels of oil or its equivalent a day. To get government spending under control, Bessent has advocated extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act with so-called pay-fors to lower its cost. That would involve either reducing spending or increasing revenue elsewhere to offset the impact. He also proposed freezing non-defense discretionary spending and reforming the subsidies for electric vehicles and other parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. Earlier this year, Bessent thought about tariffs as a negotiating tool, telling investors in a letter that, quote, the tariff gun will always be loaded on the table but rarely discharged. He has since argued for them more forcefully, especially as a source of tax revenue. In a speech last month titled Make the International Economic System Great Again, Bessent argued for increasing tariffs on national security grounds and to induce other countries to lower trade barriers with the United States. He criticized trade policy with China for enriching Wall Street, weakening domestic international might, and failing to lead to Chinese economic reform. Bessent called for tariffs to resemble the Treasury Department's sanctions program as a tool to promote U.S. interests abroad. He was open to removing tariffs from countries that undertake structural reforms and voiced support for a fair trade bloc for allies with common security interests and reciprocal approaches to tariffs. President Trump is right that actual free trade is desirable, Bessent said in prepared remarks at the time. It might seem counterintuitive from a free market perspective, but he is also right that in order to actually create a freer and more extensive trading system over the long term, we need a more activist approach internationally. So it appears instead of the reordering he wanted to be a part of, he's going to lead it, is what I think we've learned from that whole exchange and what we know about what his the policies are going to be. I think it's interesting how Trump is shifting from, we're going to have a universal 20% tariff and all this sort of thing, to more targeted tariffs, especially in light of Walmart and other companies coming out and being like, bad news. If you put a tariff on all our stuff, everything at the store is going to get more expensive. And people, again, finally finding out what they voted for. This story kind of got buried a little bit. And it should be bigger than it is. So, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, and a top arrest official, and this came out, and this basically means that anytime the Prime Minister travels to an ICC signatory country, which, by the way, the United States is not a signatory to either the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice, because of the various and sundry reasons, none the least of which is American citizens, according to our Constitution, should only have to answer to our Constitution, not an international organization, and also because given the stuff this country gets up to, if we subject ourselves to the ICC, a lot of people would be getting arrest warrants themselves. Now, Justin Trudeau has already said that if he ever comes to Canada, he will be getting arrested. It is up to, countries who are signatories to end up actually enforcing this stuff. Sometimes people get arrest warrants out and they don't end up enforcing them. Justin Trudeau has said that he would. But anyway, here's the deal. It says here, the International Criminal Court on Thursday issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel and his former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, accusing them of war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza and dealing an extraordinary blow to Israel's global standing as it presses on with wars on multiple fronts. The court also issued a warrant for the arrest of Mohammed Deif, Hamas's military chief, accusing him of crimes against humanity, including murder, hostage-taking, and sexual violence. Israel has said that it killed Mr. Deif in an airstrike, but the court said it could not determine whether he was dead. The court's chief prosecutor had requested the warrants in May. The warrants issued Thursday have not been made public, but the court said they include accusations of using starvation as a weapon of war and intentionally directing an attack against the civilian population. Mr. Netanyahu's office swiftly rejected what it called absurd and false accusations and insisted that Israel would keep fighting in Gaza to defend its citizens. The Israeli leader, quote, will not surrender to pressures. He will not recoil or withdraw until all of the war's goals that were set at the start of the battle are achieved, the office said in a statement. The decision places Mr. Netanyahu, the leader of one of the United States' closest allies, in the same lineup as President Vladimir Putin of Russia, the target of an arrest warrant issued last year. Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gallant would face the risk of arrest should they travel to one of the court's 124 member nations, which include most European countries. The United States is not a member of the court. Hamas officials celebrated the warrants against Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gallant without mentioning the accusations against Mr. Deif. Izzat al-Rishk, a senior Hamas official, said that regardless of whether arrests are made, the truth that has been revealed is that international justice is with us and against Israel. In Gaza, Palestinians expressed cautious optimism and hoped the news could signal an end to more than a year of war. And then it goes on to go into some other headlines. As I said, should have been a bigger headline than it wasn't. But it was very, very interesting that happened, and there was kind of more of a big deal about it, especially given, public opinion in the United States being more towards Israel and less towards Palestine and Gaza, with also realizing there's kind of this international movement, against what Israel's done in Gaza and the tremendous suffering that has gone on and all this sort of thing. It is interesting and compelling that you have another international institution sort of not being afraid, in my opinion, to call Israel out on its actions. And some people will say, oh, this is anti-Semitic. And I will say it, if I've said it once, I will say it again. Criticizing the government of Israel for actions the government of Israel takes is not anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism is against Jewish people. The fact that Jewish people happen to be in charge of the government is one thing. The government has made decisions. I don't care who's in charge of it. They would be needing to be called out whether they were Jewish or not. It's not anti-Semitic to criticize the government of Israel and for its actions. And here's the reality. The government of Israel has been running an apartheid regime for a while. Hamas made this attack October last, and we've had this year-long war that has killed 3 million Palestinians, mostly women and children. That's the reality of the situation. And so it's no surprise that there's been international outrage against that. There's no way you can do that and not have international outrage. So, speaking of international outrages and all this sort of thing, while Matt Gaetz is out as nominee for Attorney General, he didn't even last a full Scaramucci. His selection for nomination lasted all of 8 days. However, the Trump's pick for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, is still in the running for now. And he has his own very interesting, I would say interesting, views on things. Now, Pete Hegseth, if you don't know, that's him right there. He's a Fox News host. That's what he's most known for. He is a veteran, which I suppose is handy, but he has no experience in running a large organization. He doesn't have really any intel experience. No one really knows why he is the pick for defense, and it kind of just gets worse. So in this article from Media Matters, we find that Pete Hegseth's book includes complaints about Muslims' birth rates, praise for crusaders who push back Muslim hordes. Trump's potential defense secretary, quote, just like the Christian crusaders who pushed back the Muslim hordes in the 12th century, American crusaders will need to muster the same courage against Islamists today. Can we say Christian nationalism? Yes, we can. And this was a Media Matters story from 2020 on his anti-Muslim history, and it says here, Pete Hegseth is an anti-Muslim bigot who's warned followers about the Muslim birth rate in states like Michigan, criticized the election of Muslims to public office, and praised President Donald Trump's call for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. Hegseth is a co-host of Fox and Friends Weekend Edition. He's an influential pro-Trump voice who's lobbied Trump to pardon people convicted of war crimes. Hegseth himself has endorsed committing war crimes. again, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be your new Secretary of Defense. It also says here that Hegseth has pushed anti-Muslim rhetoric on Fox News. For instance, in February 2016 segment about Hamtramck, Michigan, which has a Muslim majority, Hegseth pushed fears about the assimilation and integration of Muslims. In May 2017, Hegseth criticized then Minneapolis Mayor Betsy Hodges for giving her State of the City address at a mosque. He stated, quote, this is the left doing everything they can to fall over themselves to fawn over a new community, unquote. In May of 2018, Hegseth said of France, I hate to put it this way, but I think it's true. They've got a slow motion 9/11 happening in their borders in France. Demography matters. Muslims are having 2.6 kids, whereas French folks are having 1.6 kids. Hegseth is also a supporter of then Florida Republican congressional candidate Laura Loomer, who had described herself as a proud Islamophobe, has said that she didn't care about the anti-Muslim mass shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand, and has stated that she's in favor of more migrant deaths. Hegseth has repeatedly defended Loomer and said that he hopes she wins and wins big, and posted a now-deleted tweet containing a donation link for her campaign. Hegseth makes his anti-Muslim views clear in his book American Crusade, which was released in May of 2020. In it, he wrote that just like the Christian crusaders who pushed back the Muslim hordes in the 12th century, American crusaders will need to muster the same courage against Islamists today. Warned about Muslims' birth rates in states like Michigan, New York, and Minnesota, and complained about the number of Muslim Americans who've been elected to office across the U.S. And then he goes into excerpts. And it's kind of honestly, a lot of it is the standard Christian nationalist idea. Like this quote right here. With enough leftism and enough time, anything is possible for Islamists. As I reported extensively on Fox News, certain cities in my home state of Minnesota have started to look much different thanks to overwhelming and intentional Muslim immigration. What started with good intentions, see Somali Omar in Chapter 1, and peaceful refugees eventually evolved into insular communities. Internationally funded mosques, welfare fraud, culture clashes, and radicalization. Then, as Muslims' birth rates have grown alongside their political influence, local tolerant populations have made concessions. Critics are called racist, crimes are hidden from the public, and the European cycle has begun. Similar trends are happening in other states, including Michigan and New York. It also says, where our two oceans, barriers to refugee invasions, and traditional Christian fabric have insulated us well, but we're losing them quickly. American leftists insist on pursuing the very same policies that led to cultural invasion in Europe. The unholy alliance between leftists and Islamists means that open borders, non-assimilation, erosion of national allegiance, and toleration of the intolerable has left the door open for Islamists to establish a foothold in our country. In November 2019, 26 Muslim candidates won elected office in the United States. Muhammad is now a top 10 boys' name in America. What will it be in 2030? And it says we must not only tolerate Islam and Islamists, we must celebrate them. Islamists, even mainstream Muslims, use aggressive tactics to exploit American tolerance as an weakness in order to achieve accommodations. Hegseth complained that Islamists happily exploit the view that celebrates Muslim immigration to seed the West with as many Muslims as possible, and that Trump was right for calling for a Muslim ban. So, that is your new Secretary of Defense, everybody. Among other, just him not being terribly qualified and all this type of thing, that level of Islamophobia is a bit concerning. And I will say this of the Islamophobia piece, I don't necessarily completely disagree when it comes to cultural assimilation and the way people, from these countries sometimes do or do not assimilate into our society. I do think that is a bit of a problem. There's definitely, in France with no-go zones, French women getting attacked in public for being outside without a man or not wearing a headscarf, all this type of thing. Those things are real, and those things are happening, and those things are not good. Let's just say that. Those things are not good. However, it is very concerning having someone with, I would say, rather regressive views on that in a position of high office. That's definitely concerning, and I think is worth thinking about and worth talking about. As I said, Trump is not having any of his nominees vetted by the FBI. Some of the Senate has said that they're not going to consider nominees that are not vetted by the FBI. So we're in for a pretty nasty nomination showdown in terms of the Senate trying to insert its right to advise and consent, and Trump, maybe saying, screw it. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of all of that. Obviously, one of the big, nomination stories this week was Matt Gaetz, not lasting a full Scaramucci and getting, pulling his nomination, after 8 days due to his his history with, potentially having, allegedly and potentially having sex with underage sex workers in Florida, for which his buddy that hooked him up with that went to jail and all this type of thing. And Trump then swapped him out for the Attorney General of Florida, a woman by the name of Pam Bondi, like the beach in Australia. And um and it and she'll probably actually be more effective than Matt Gaetz was. But the reality is, you have a lot of people that Trump just likes. They're not necessarily qualified for these positions. They don't have any experience. They're literally the only litmus test you need to be a Trump nominee is, are you going to be loyal to Trump, and are you going to put in the most insane of his policies they want to put in? That's it. As long as you can do and accomplish that, you're in. You're totally in. So that that's the state of things right now. It's gonna be a long 4 years. I'll just say that right now. It's gonna be a long ass 4 years. It's gonna be a long time, and a long time of this sort of constant Trump circus. And to kind of bring this conversation full circle, and then I'll let you go, is this is so endemic of what the Trump circus is. And I think people have maybe forgotten this was every day for 4 years. Who was coming, who was going, what was happening. Trump likes that chaos. Trump enjoys that constant tension. He likes putting people against each other to see whoever wins the fight, wins the wrestling match, that's who he's gonna go with. He enjoys that. And so all of this stuff happening, and all this attention, and all this back and forth, and blah blah blah, Trump likes that. That's how he manages. That's what he likes to do. And I don't think people understand that. I don't think they understand that this is what Trump likes and enjoys. And I think we're in for a long 4 years of this, or longer, because I'm not convinced Trump will leave power when he's supposed to, but that's just my own personal opinion. I don't have any evidence to back that up, other than stuff that he has said and indicated about suspending the Constitution, or not having to vote ever again, or all this type of thing. So, I always try to stop at about 45 minutes, because this can all get very long, and it's a lot. It's a lot. So, I'll let you go. My name is Cameron Cowan. This has been the Cameron Journal Newshour. Please follow me online on Blue Sky at Cameron Journal, on Twitter, Instagram at Cameron Cowan, Facebook.com/Cameron L. Cowan. And if you don't want to write those down, don't worry. They're all right at the top of the website at CameronJournal.com. And don't forget to subscribe. I do a weekly newsletter every Saturday, wrapping you up with headlines with commentary, and also the latest stuff from me, including this news hour and the interview. We have a really great interview on the channel this week with a YouTube star named APT Songs, who had some viral hits back in the late aughts, early tens, and he is reintroducing himself with a new album and new music, and he's on the interview this week. Last week we had a really great interview with a guy named Ken Good, talking about criminal justice reform, and so much more. So, make sure to catch those on YouTube. And actually, they're on YouTube, on Facebook, all this type of thing. The only place you're not going to see them is if you're watching this on Twitch. They're not there. Head over to YouTube at Cameron Journal and check all that stuff out. And obviously, there's tons of videos and things to watch. All of my archives this summer, I posted all the original audio episodes from 2020, 2021, and 2022 are live on the channel now. So feel free to check those out, including one that's very germane to what we're talking about right now, the American presidency, which I posted on Election Day on CameronJournal.com. So thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you soon, and I'll see you next week.